Hey guys, Gary here, and today we're going to answer a question. Do you know how I would create a save and load function in Visual Basic? I would have to write the variables values and such to XML or a text file, would I not? And then load it into the program, read it from the text file, and put the values back into text boxes. Well, let's take a look at this. To start with, there are many different ways of saving data to either text files, XML files, or databases, or even online services. But we're going to concentrate on what the question is about, and we're going to talk about saving data with XML from Visual Basic. Now, Visual Studio gives us some really neat tools to make this as simple as possible, so we're going to take a look at those. So right here I have Visual Studio open with a standard .NET application running with VB, and we have just our basic Form 1 VB here. The first thing that we need to do is create a data set to keep our data in. So we're going to right click on our project and we're going to click Add New Item, and we're going to look on this list here and we should find Data Set. And Data Set, we're going to call this DS for Data Set Users. Now what a data set is a data set is a particular kind of a file that allows you to manipulate data. You can add, delete, whatever, and then take that data and save it to some sort of a file or database. But instead of having to constantly contact the database or the file and try to reread the information, it's kind of a holding source where you can manipulate everything and not constantly be writing back and forth. And then when you're ready to save, then you can save the data set back to your actual file or wherever you're going to save it to. So you notice that it opened up here and it just has a little notation. It says use the dataset designer to visually create and edit type datasets. So we can do this, and we can do it just by clicking on the toolbox. The toolbox will bring this little toolbox up on the right here. And we can take a data table and put a data table in. And we're going to call this data table DT users, and in the data table we want to create 4 fields. So if we right click and click add, you can see it says column, and you'll notice next to it it said Control L. So Control L will allow us to create more on the fly real quick and easy. The first column we're going to work with is going to be the ID for our user. So we can call that ID, or we can call it user ID, whatever you want to call it. And if we go to our properties pane, once we're on our ID, make sure that you see that in the name field here. We'll go down through these properties and see what we can do. So the first thing is, do we want to allow a null value? No, we do not want to allow a null value, because this is going to be the ID that's going to differentiate this user from everybody else. So if we're going to save on here a username and a first name and a last name. So I'm just going to do that real quick. I'm going to put first name, and then we'll do another one here, last name, and we'll do last thing is going to be the gamer tag. Okay, so if there are 2 users named Tom Jones, one in California, one in New York, we want them both to be able to add a user file and be able to do it with their own individual gamer tags. And of course we don't want to get them confused with each other. So going back to our ID here, the next column we have here is auto increment. Well, we don't want somebody to create their own ID number, because then you have to check it against everything and go through all kinds of issues. So here, yes, we want to auto increment, and then our seed value for auto increment should be 0. And our auto increment step should be 1. So we want to add 1 record each time. Okay, and then caption is what they see on the form in the end. So rather than changing it on the form all the time, you're going to want to change the ID or the caption here. So just in case we show this on the form, I'm just going to put a little colon next to it. And then the type for this particular item is going to be a system32, int32. The date time mode we're not going to be worrying about. And default value, you want to keep away from using default values if possible. Unless you have a specific use case to use a default value, you really don't want to, because in our example here, our ID is not allowed to be null. So by the ID not being allowed to be null, if we put something in the default value and somebody doesn't change it, it's just going to add that value in. And that can cause security leaks and stuff where people can just go on there, leave all the default values in, submit it in, and maybe change their password or username or whatever. And we don't want to have that. So then we can add an expression if we wanted to. Max length at -1 means there is no max length. It's not going to stop them or cut down what they're putting in. The null value is going to throw an exception. So you're going to want to take care of that exception later on. You can also have it just do nothing or stay empty. We'll leave it there. Read only. For the ID, yes, we want to make it read only. We don't want them to be able to change it. It's going to auto increment itself, so that's okay. And then we also want to make sure that it's a unique value in the entire database that we have. So that makes it a key that allows it to be differentiated from anything else. Okay, so that's how we set up the ID. And then we'll go to first name. And in first name, we're just going to go to caption here, leave a space, go to the end and put a colon. And that's set at a string, so that's fine. And we want to make sure that they cannot enter in a null. And we don't care if it's unique or not, because there could be a Tom Smith on New York and a Tom Smith in California. So we want them both to be able to put in their names, even though their names are the same. So we're going to do the same thing for our last name. We're going to just change our null value. Make sure that's not allowed. And we're just going to put a space between last and name. Put a colon. Again, you could change this on the form, but if you change it here, it saves you from having to change it on the form. If you're using it on more than one different form, it's already set up and formatted for you. So lastly, we have the gamer tag here. We do not want it to be null. And we want to make sure we put a space in here. And this one we want to make sure is unique, because Tom Smith in New York might be awesome man, and Tom Smith in California may be not so awesome man. And our gamer tags don't want to be confusing with each other. And that's basically it for our data table. And I just want to show you one other little thing, just for informational wise, and that is that you can actually create relational data tables with this tool. So if I go over and I grab another data table and bring it in, and I just name this games, and maybe we'll add a few columns on here. First one, maybe we'll make games ID. Second one, maybe we'll make, oops, I didn't want to do that, so I'm going to close that and do not save it, because it tried to add a method for me. So this one will be user ID, and then the last one will be the name of the game. So I'm not going to go through all the editing except for user ID. This is what I'm going to use to link this folder over to this one. So games ID would be just like this one. Now user ID, we don't have to worry about making it into a key. All we need to do is make sure that we understand that the ID that we're going to track it to, which is our user's ID here, is a system int32. So we'll go back here, and this would be a system string. We can't compare a string to an int32, so we need to change this to int32. Okay, and then what we would do is we just go over to this little gray area next to user ID, and make sure you're in the gray area. You left click and you drag straight out. Okay, sometimes with these tables it's a little tricky. If you go off to a different direction or something, it'll highlight, or it won't always do exactly what you want it to do. But usually if you get just to the end here and just click out to the left, I don't know why it's so touchy, and then we're going to take that line and we're going to take it to the ID on the users, DT users. And it's going to open this relation table. Now the relation table controls the relation between those two fields and then those two tables in turn. So it tells us here that games DT users specifies a key for the parent table of games and the child table of DT users. And then it'll show the columns that you're going to compare. And then in our case, we're going to make it both relation and foreign key restraint. And we want to make sure it's cascaded for the update rule and for the delete rule. And then there's none in for accept reject rule. And basically what that does is we click OK here. If we look in close, we can see that on this side, on the user side, there's an infinity symbol. And on the game side, there's a key. So that means for each game, there can be an infinite amount of users. So if you wanted to have a game where you're listing out the users that are logged in or whatever, you might have a field on here called logged in that you're tracking. And then every time somebody logs in, it adds it to that list. And then you can list it out for the game. So that's what the relational data tables do. So we're not going to use this for simplicity's sake on the rest of our example. So I'm going to get rid of that. Click Save. And then we're going to take a look at what happened here. So we're going to close this out. And now we're back on our form. And now we need a tool that we need to look at, which may not be on your tag here. So if you go up to Views, Other Windows, and go up to Data Sources, you can see Data Sources. You can open that and you can dock that wherever you want to. And in my case, I have it docked here. And we want to look, here's our DS users. So that's our data source. And here's our data table. And under here are our fields that we want to work with. Now, this right now, it just has everything set up as a text box. See by the little symbol here. If I click next to one of these and click the little down arrow, it'll show us. So we can do a list box, link table, label, combo box, or text box. Okay, so if we didn't want to show the ID number, we could go up there and we could click none, and it wouldn't show it on the table. You can take these fields and you can actually track them right over, and they're on the form for you. Or you can go to the top here to the whole table, and you can either send in a data grid view. Let's take a look at that, see what that looks like. Make this a little bigger here. Okay, so the data grid view, is your standard checkbook style Excel spreadsheet where you can enter in the information. Or you can go in and just do details view, and that will bring in each of the items together. And then you can reformat them however you want to. Now, in our case, the ID, we don't want anybody to change that, but we do want to see what it looks like. So I'm just going to change it to a label. And then when I go back to DT users and drag it in, there it is. Now it's just a label, nobody can change that. Okay, so now for simplicity's sake, we'll make this a little smaller here. Okay, so now we see at the top here, we have a bar. So where did that come from? Well, when we dropped this in, it did several things for us. First, it added our data set users to this form. It added our data table users, binding source. That's the source you're getting it from, the file or whatever you're getting it from. And the navigator, which is this bar at the top. Now you'll notice that we can run this, and here we go, and we can put in whatever we want, and then add. And you can see that it added a record, but there's nothing there. I can't go back to it or anything. And that's because this navigation form, for whatever reason, actually starts without any kind of a record being selected. So what we want to do when we run this, you'll notice here it says it's 0 records of 0 records at the top. So we hook plus, and now it's 1 of 1. And our ID is 0 because that's where it's a 0-based adding format. And that was our seed. So now if we put in, and we hit the add button, now we have 2 of 2. And then here we have Now you can see that there's 3 records of 3 records, and if we go back, we can page back through them, and we can see the records that we have so far. Now, this is all fine and dandy, except that when we click the X and we restart the app, we have no more records, because nothing was saved yet. All that was it was put into our data set, and we were able to work with it. But we didn't actually save it to a file, so it never loaded it in. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that. So if we go back to our form design view here, and we right-click on our Save button, we'll click Enable, and then we can double-click on our Save button, and that'll bring up our method for saving a record. So we're going to do something outside of the method first, and we're going to go down here, and we're going to create private. We'll call this my XML file path. We're going to equal that to XML user data. Not date, data. There you go. .xml. Okay, so now we know what our file is going to be called. Now let's actually see about what the steps are that we need to take to actually save the records. So we'll go into our method here. And the first thing we want to do in our method is to validate our form. So we'll say me meaning this form, validate. The next thing we want to do is make sure that nobody else is editing the form at the same time that we are while we're trying to save up to our record. So we'll say dt user binding source dot end edit. So that'll prevent anybody else from editing while we're working on it. Oh. Lastly, we want to save the item to the file, so we're going to say that ds users this time, or we're going to write XML, and then we're going to say to my XML file path. Okay, now that should save our record to the file path, but we have no way of actually telling that yet because we have no way to actually pull up the record in the beginning. So we're going to do that by, we're going to go to the beginning here before, I like to keep this one of the first methods. And we're going to go up to Form 1 and go to Form 1 Events, and under Events, we're going to go to Load. Okay, and then we're just going to take this record, I'm going to move this up, this method. So now when the page loads, when the app actually loads, we'll be able to check to see what our records are and enter the records in. So we're going to do this by if my.computer dot file system dot file exists file path, then dt users, sorry, not dt, ds users, it's the data set, ds users dot read XML, and use our file path again. Okay, now it's very important that we use an if statement here because right now we don't have a XAML file. And if I would go and comment these out and try to run this program, it's going to give me an error message. You'll see it'll give me an error message here saying it could not find the file. Now, a common mistake when working with databases or with file structures like this is you put in some kind of a test data file and you start testing away and everything seems to work fine, and then you publish out your app and people start screaming at you because they can't get past to even getting it started because they don't have that data file yet. So in order to eliminate that, you always want to make sure that the system will run without the data file. You can let them know there's no data file if you wish, but the best way to do it usually is just to put an if statement around it, in which case you'll just open the app, there just won't be any data, and then they can continue on their way. They don't need to know. They can tell here that there is no data. Okay? So now that we have the data loaded in, which there is none at the moment, and we decided we're going to save it to that path, we still don't have an XML file. And that's what we want to save to, right? So let's take a look at how this works. Let's run this. And we will go in here. Now, you'll notice it says 0 of 0 records. Okay, so make sure we're adding the plus sign first. Now we're on 1 of 1. Okay, and we'll add in our first name again here. And what was it? Just hello. Okay, and then we'll add our second one, which would be John Smith. And it was JS101. Okay, that's good enough. All right, now we save, and nothing happens. Now, we'll discuss what we can do with that in a moment, but let's see if anything did happen. Let's close that out and restart. And we restart, and hey, what do you know? Our information's still there. We can still page through it and see that we have records. Okay, so it's saved. Well, where did it save? Well, it's saved to our file path, and if we go into the file of this application, we can find that file. Let me show you how you do that. Okay, so here I have the folder with my project in it. And when the app is running, it would be whatever folder that the app is running in. In our case here, we have a bin, and we go to debug. So this is the folder where the application would actually be running on Windows, let's say. And right here you can see our XML user data XML. If we open this up, we end up with an XML file, all formatted, all set to go, with all of our IDs and everything in it. So there you go, we saved it to an XML file. So let's see what's next. Okay, the next thing that I want to show you really quickly is, right now I have 1 of 2 records, okay? I'm able to page through those 2 records. If I want to create a new record, I hit the plus sign, right? And in here, I'm just going to add Nancy Johnson Potato. Okay, now if I hit plus instead of the save button here, and then I go and I hit save, we're going to get an error message that says that no nulls are allowed. The reason is because I hit the plus sign instead of the save sign. So let's refresh here. We have our 2 records, okay? Now if I hit plus, and this time I hit save, I have no problem. Except it doesn't tell me that I saved it. I can still page back and forth through it. The reason why it does that is because once I hit plus, I'm creating another record. Okay, and when I validate, I'm validating that I have empty fields, and I'm not allowed to have empty fields, remember? So if I try to navigate away or something, it's going to give me weird errors. So just keep that in mind. You're going to want to put up some type of a notation to somebody who's trying to maneuver out of there without the validation correct. Go in and you can add your validation to it to create that. But while you're doing your testing here, just keep in mind that if you're going to add a record, the plus sign is to add the record. The save button is to save the records that are there. If you accidentally hit plus next, then you're going to end up with a problem. It's going to keep giving you that error. Okay, so now we hit save, but nothing is showing up. So let's see how we can tell people what's going on. Okay, so we'll do this we'll just go back to our form here, and then we'll just add in I have my toolbox on the right here. You may have yours in a different place, but nonetheless. So we'll have our label here, and in our properties for our label parents, where it says text here, we want to get rid of that because we don't want any text on it initially. And now we don't see anything there unless we want to write to it. Now there's several ways you can do this. I'm going to try to keep this a simple, easy way. And that is that when we go into our Save Items Collect here, and we actually go to save our data, we'll do it with a try statement. And first thing we'll do, just to make sure everything's okay, is we'll say label status text equals nothing. And then we'll try to write our data. And then if everything goes all right, then we'll say label status.text equals. Okay, and if it doesn't, then we'll just say label status says something wrong. Then we can just do something like this. Okay, so I'm going to change this just a little bit. I'm going to move the try up to the very start of this before we even validate. And then I'm going to change this to message instead of just to string, because that's a shorter version of what the error is. And let's take a look at this. So now if we start this, and if we add a new record, let's say this one is Bob Thomas, and he wants BT22. We save this, record saved successfully. If we do that little goof I told you about where we hit plus first and then hit save, oh, something went wrong. Your record was not saved. Error, column first name does not allow nulls. Oh, then they know, hey, I got to go back in here and put in some kind of information and then save. And then there we go. Now we have all our records we can still page through. So there we go. Okay, and just to elaborate a little bit on something we discussed earlier, is with where our file is saved. If we take this application now, we have it all finished, we're all ready to go. You know, we take this application and I say, move it, copy it over to my desktop. And now it's here on my desktop, and I double click it. You see it runs fine, like any other application, but you're going to notice I don't have any records. And the main reason is because there's no XML file. So now if I just add real simple records real quick here, see records saved successfully, and right there is our XML file. So in order to transfer information, if you're going to send along the XML file needs to be saved in the same folder as whatever your exe file is. So if we wanted to, I could take this, I could delete it. Then I could also take this XML user data and move this, copy this to my desktop. And we see that there, and we open it up, and here we go. We still have all of the records that we had. So it's just important to understand where that file needs to be in order for the system to check it. It's not going to look on your C drive. It's not going to look on some other drive unless you set it specifically for that. This way, it's just going to check the installation file, the folder, wherever the file is sitting. Now, it's also important to understand that if you save this XML file to a protected part of the hard drive, like the C drive, and you try to run this program, it's just going to give you error messages and not be able to read that file. So it's always important that whatever folder that you put this exe file in, it's a folder that's accessible from that user, and that the XML file is being saved right in that same folder. That's why we did it this way. So there you go. Now you just saved a file to an XML file, and you have records that you can work with, and you should be good to go. I hope that answers your question, and we will see you next time.